Hello everyone, it is the AI developer back at you once again with another video. This time we're going to be talking about a diagram here, and this is going to be, we may make this one video or we may make a follow-up video where we actually get into the application, the MVP version of the application, and demonstrate the back end for you guys. Right now, let's go ahead and start off by introducing myself. Well, first and foremost, I am a certified software engineer with over 15 years of overall experience in tech. I got my start out in cybersecurity when pen testing wasn't really well known or something that was actually even legal, per today's standards, where you actually have certified pen testers and you have what's called, vulnerability analysis and things like that. You have this whole sector of tech that was kind of created off of these folks who wanted to be white hat hackers in a sense. So that's where I kind of got my start early on. I was really heavy into platforms like Bugcrowd, heavy into hacking and cybersecurity, for lack of a better term. And that pretty much got me over into programming, and then eventually into using programming to build my own websites, starting off with drag and drop tools, then eventually getting it more deeper into CSS, HTML, JavaScript, then eventually getting into frameworks such as React, Next.js, Vue. I mean, the list goes on and on. Expo, which utilizes React Native. Backstage, utilizing React and TypeScript. So just a bunch of different experience. Also certified in AWS and Azure. So one could say that I'm a cloud expert, with another certification coming soon in Terraform. So that's a little bit about myself. I also, currently work day to day as a certified software engineer for a top 5 healthcare company in the healthcare sector. So, and it's probably a company that you visit every day. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the actual content of the video here. So what we're going to be talking about today is a diagram here that's going to diagram the separation of concerns for a backend for a sports betting application. So we're going to start off by taking a look at the high-level architecture overview and separation of the UI, backend, and serverless functions. Because serverless is something that I'm big on. I don't like having to use a server if I don't have to, because it just makes things faster, right? Whenever you're dealing with data, having a database and having a backend is always going to be, I wouldn't call it tech debt, but it's always going to be an extra overhead, right? So this is going to kind of detail how I would lay out an app, or how I have laid out an app for sports betting. And so let's go ahead and dig into it. So this is the very first portion we're going to focus on here today, is this high-level architecture overview of the UI, backend, and then the serverless functions, which are going to be in the cloud, right? Whether it be AWS, Firebase, or whatever your preference. So we have 3 main elements here. So we have our client, which is the front end. This is going to be comprised of the React Native UI layer, the state management, which is going to be utilizing Formic for validation. Then we have the I don't know why we have Formic right there next to the state management. This is going to be with Redux. And then validation is Formix. Okay, so then we have API calls via Axios, pretty standard. We have the bet placement UI, and then we have the odds viewing UI. So just separate views for being able to place bets and then view the current odds. And then so we're going to be sending API requests from the client front end to the back end, which is very standard in a full stack application, right? So our backend API is going to be comprised of user services, which of course we're going to have auth. We're utilizing auth 0 for this. We're going to have a betting service. This is going to be like our main business logic. Then we have our odds service, also our business logic, but this is going to be more real-time data fetching. and rendering. Then we have our data layer, which is going to be our database in MySQL. And so this, usually you'll stop here. You just have you'd have everything living in the back end. But, as an extra layer, we can kind of have these event triggers that we send to our serverless functions. And then our serverless functions are what are actually going to handle the user authentication, the bet submissions, the event-driven updates, the AWS Lambda functions, and the odds updates. So you just the back end is essentially just calling these functions and handling these functions, and then the front end is calling the back end. So you have a clear separation of everything, rather than having the back end kind of hold a lot of the, because there's quite a bit of logic here. So you can kind of separate the logic between the serverless functions in the back end, and kind of have more handling logic in your back end API, and then have more of your actual business logic be in the serverless functions, right? So let's see. That's just one example of the one piece, or kind of like a more of an overview of all of the components, the full stack application at a glance. Now we can kind of dig more into the UI flow using serverless and Auth0, right? So you are going to need a serverless account and also an Auth0 account if you don't already have one, to utilize these technologies in this application if you want to be building along with me. Let's see, we're at 6 minutes here, so we're good to go. So this is going to be comprised of, we're going to have our authentication module. This is going to be in our backend, excuse me. So we're going to have our login, logout, token handling, which is JWT, and then permissions management for users, right? And this module is going to send an authorization request to the Auth0, and that's going to verify the token. It's going to check the permissions, and then it's going to also handle the user management, right? And then that's going to send an auth response to the AWS Lambda, and that's going to handle the actual logic. It's going to generate the session token and manage the token expiry. So that's essentially the flow of data. And then once we get that session token back, we're essentially be logged in. And moving over to the betting service, here's an example betting service module, and how that betting service is going to pretty much interact with the AWS Lambda first, and then that data is going to be saved into the database. So you have the betting service module. So this is going to handle users when they place a bet, when we calculate payouts, and also when we fetch and update live odds. We're going to send API requests to our AWS Lambda Cloud function, and that's going to actually process the bet. It's going to actually handle the calculation, and then it's going to actually fetch the odds from the external API, and then we're going to actually write that data to the MySQL database. So your AWS Lambda is what's actually going to touch your MySQL database, and so it's a very clear separation of concerns, so you can kind of have things live separately, and in case things go wrong, you don't have everything sitting in one place. Or in the case that you want to add on or add new features, it's very easy to kind of add new features because everything is so clearly separated, right? It just makes everything more easily organized and more efficient as well, performance wise. And then we get into serverless function overview. This is more getting into more scalable and modular logic. So this is just breaking down the AWS Lambda functions at a glance, right? So the whole goal of this is to create small, distinct logic pieces that auto scale with load, right? To have essentially dynamic load balancing, essentially handling scaling dynamically as load increases. Easy, and then it's also easy to add new features, right? Because of these small, distinct logic pieces, as I was mentioning earlier. And a couple of example functions we can have, like I was mentioning, we saw in the earlier diagrams, are user authentication using Auth0, bet submission, odds updates, and notifications using Twilio. So these are all simple functions that we can kind of have, and we can kind of be calling these from our handlers. Yeah. So then we have the backend services. This is just an example of how the backend services will kind of be laid out at a glance. And then also, how these backend services can kind of share different utility a utility layer that kind of handles session management, error handling, and logging. These can be these are reusable utility modules that essentially every app will have, right? So just standard stuff there. And then more specific to this app, well, we have our user service, which encompasses authentication and session management, of course. Then specific to this application, we'll have our betting service and our odds service. So our betting service will have a bet submission, and like we mentioned earlier, it'll handle payout calculation. And then we'll have our odds service handling real-time odds updates, so users can see like the odds in real time, so they can have the best chances to have all the information they need to place those bets. And this will also handle API integrations, for how we're actually getting that odds data, right? So that's it for the diagram. I hope that kind of explained an example of how you would go about setting up this is an example of how you would go about setting up a sports betting application, right, the right way. And this is, you don't have to use serverless functions, right? You can take that portion out, but this is a great way that utilizes separation of concerns. And I'm also going to follow up this video with an MVP video showing you guys how to actually build this application out, right? So let's end it here. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for the next one. As always, keep coding, coders.